It was the sweltering summer of 1942. The Pacific sun beat down mercilessly on the islands of Guadalcanal, painting the dense jungles in shades of oppressive green and shadow. The air was thick with the scent of saltwater, gunpowder, and the constant, metallic tang of fear. From the trees above, shadows flickered, soldiers moving cautiously through the undergrowth, each step a silent prayer, each heartbeat a drum warning of unseen danger. The Japanese forces had learned, quickly and brutally, that in this theater of war, the enemy they feared most was not the distant army divisions they had read about, nor the sprawling fleets they had once underestimated. It was the Marines. These men were different, hardened, disciplined, and relentless. They carried a presence that weighed on the jungle like an unshakable storm. Their footsteps left invisible trails of chaos and calculated destruction. To the Japanese soldier, the American Marine was a living nightmare, an opponent who struck with uncanny precision, fought with an unyielding ferocity, and seemed to thrive where others would falter. Rumors spread through the ranks, whispered among weary troops, of Marine units that would emerge unscathed from ambushes that had decimated entire battalions, of close-quarters battles where courage alone could not guarantee survival. And as night fell over the tropical islands, the forests echoed with the haunting sounds of battle, the staccato crack of rifles, the muffled cries of men caught in the chaos, the low rumble of artillery shaking the earth beneath their feet. For every Japanese soldier who had faced them, the memory of the Marines was etched in fear and respect, a lesson written in blood that would never be forgotten. The fear that Japanese soldiers felt toward American Marines in the Pacific theater during World War II was rooted first and foremost in the extraordinary preparation and discipline with which these men entered combat. Unlike many other Allied or Axis forces, the Marines were trained not simply as soldiers but as specialized warriors capable of surviving and dominating in the harshest and most unpredictable environments. This rigorous preparation began long before the first engagement on a Pacific island. It was the product of decades of institutional development, tactical innovation, and an ethos that fused endurance with aggression. From the moment a young recruit stepped onto a Marine Corps base, he was subjected to a regimen designed to test both body and mind. Physical training pushed men to the limits of fatigue, requiring them to run miles in all conditions, carry heavy packs over difficult terrain, and master obstacle courses that simulated combat scenarios. Every drill was intended to make them capable of operating when every element of their environment was working against them, from oppressive heat and humidity to dense foliage that could hide both friend and foe. But physical toughness was only part of the preparation. Mental conditioning was equally, if not more, important. Marines were trained to make decisions under extreme stress, to react quickly to sudden threats, and to maintain composure when surrounded by chaos. In contrast to the more hierarchical and rigid structures that characterized many Japanese infantry units at the time, the Marines emphasized initiative at the small unit level. A platoon leader, a squad leader, or even an individual Marine was expected to recognize danger, identify opportunity, and act without waiting for orders. This ability to act independently within a coordinated framework was disorienting to Japanese troops who had been trained to follow strict orders and operate according to predictable strategies. The adaptability of the Marines allowed them to exploit mistakes instantly, to turn ambushes into counterattacks, and to operate effectively even when separated from their larger units. Training extended beyond land maneuvers. Marines destined for the Pacific theater underwent amphibious warfare exercises that were unprecedented in scale and realism. They practiced landing on beaches under simulated fire, coordinating naval gunfire support, and moving inland through difficult terrain while maintaining combat effectiveness. Japanese forces, encountering Marines who seemed to emerge from the water fully prepared and organized, were often astonished at how these men could seamlessly integrate sea, shore, and jungle in a single operation. The combination of amphibious skill and infantry proficiency made Marines uniquely suited to the island-hopping campaigns, where the terrain itself could be as deadly as the enemy. The consequences of this preparation became clear in actual combat. Japanese soldiers quickly learned that facing Marines was not like facing other Allied units. A frontal attack that might overwhelm an Army unit often failed against a Marine squad that had been drilled to anticipate such movements. Ambushes, surprise night attacks, and infiltration tactics were met with counters that were not only effective but executed with a speed and precision that seemed uncanny. Japanese troops described encounters with Marines as disorienting, frustrating, and terrifying, not only because of the physical danger but because the Marines seemed to anticipate their every move. Even when outnumbered, Marines could hold ground, reorganize under fire, and execute counterattacks that inflicted heavy casualties. Part of what made the Marines so effective was their ability to integrate every element of training into combat seamlessly. It was not merely that they were physically tough or mentally resilient, but that these qualities were applied in combination. When a Marine squad moved through dense jungle, each man was alert to the potential for enemy fire from any angle, aware of the terrain, and capable of using that terrain for both defense and offense. Weapons were used with discipline, not recklessness, but with a confidence that came from extensive practice. The Japanese, accustomed to more static battlefield tactics and formalized assaults, were often caught off guard by the fluidity and unpredictability of Marine maneuvers. This unpredictability became a source of dread, because it meant that there was no safe pattern, no predictable sequence of events, and no way to anticipate the Marines' next move. Leadership within the Marine Corps further enhanced this fear. Non-commissioned officers and officers alike were trained to lead by example, often fighting alongside their men and demonstrating composure in the face of danger. This contrasted sharply with the more hierarchical structure of Japanese units, where junior officers and enlisted men often lacked the autonomy to respond creatively to sudden threats. Japanese soldiers observed that Marine leaders were not only competent but deeply connected to the men under their command, able to inspire courage and coordinate complex maneuvers in real time. This unity of leadership and initiative meant that the Marines could respond to ambushes, adapt to unexpected conditions, and maintain operational effectiveness in situations where other forces might collapse. Another element of the Marines' advantage lay in their approach to combat endurance. The harsh climate of the Pacific Islands, oppressive heat, relentless humidity, disease, and poor living conditions, exacted a heavy toll on all troops. Japanese soldiers, accustomed to different climates and operational tempos, sometimes found themselves physically drained and mentally fatigued in ways they had not anticipated. The Marines' training emphasized not only survival but the ability to maintain fighting capacity under such stress. They learned to ration themselves, maintain their weapons and equipment in challenging conditions, and continue fighting even when exhausted. The Japanese came to see this endurance as almost unnatural, a quality that amplified the danger posed by American troops. The combination of physical conditioning, mental resilience, tactical innovation, and leadership produced a force that Japanese soldiers found uniquely intimidating. Whereas other Allied units could be predicted, outmaneuvered, or overwhelmed through traditional tactics, Marines operated in a way that defied these expectations. The fear they inspired was not mere propaganda or exaggeration. It was the result of countless engagements in which Marines consistently outperformed the enemy, inflicted disproportionate casualties, and maintained cohesion under extreme stress. Reports from Japanese officers often highlighted the shock of facing opponents who seemed to know the battlefield better than they did, who adapted instantly to changing conditions, and who fought with a ferocity that was methodical rather than chaotic. This fear was compounded by the psychological effect of witnessing Marines execute well-coordinated counterattacks. In the jungle, where visibility was limited and engagements could erupt without warning, Japanese soldiers often felt surrounded, outmatched, and unable to predict their opponent's next move. A single Marine squad could turn an ambush into a trap for the ambushers, forcing retreat or surrender under conditions where the Japanese expected victory. Even experienced units that had fought elsewhere in the Pacific admitted that facing Marines was unlike any other battle experience. The discipline, training, and ferocity of these men created a perception that no matter how well prepared the Japanese were, the Marines would find a way to prevail. In many ways, the fear of the Marines stemmed not only from the immediate danger they posed but from their reliability and consistency. Unlike opponents who might falter under pressure, Marine units almost invariably performed according to training and expectation. Their tactics were rehearsed but flexible, their movements precise but adaptable, and their coordination seamless even under fire. This consistency created a sense of inevitability for the Japanese soldier. To face a Marine unit was to face an opponent who would execute the full range of combat competencies with near perfection. The combination of skill, endurance, and tactical sophistication made the Marines a unique and dreaded adversary. Ultimately, the Japanese hatred, or more accurately, deep fear, of the American Marines was rooted in respect earned through repeated, brutal encounters. The Marines' relentless preparation, their innovative approach to combat, and their ability to maintain effectiveness under extreme conditions made them unlike any other force in the Pacific. For soldiers who relied on predictable strategy, massed attacks, and strict hierarchy, the adaptability, skill, and cohesion of the Marines were a revelation, and a source of terror. Each engagement reinforced the lesson that the Marines could not be underestimated, that even numerical superiority offered no guarantee of success, and that the jungle itself seemed to bend to their disciplined will. The fear that emerged was not a fleeting emotion but a lasting imprint, shaping the perception of the Marines as a combat force that demanded respect, caution, and vigilance. Beyond the physical prowess and rigorous training of the American Marines, a key factor in why Japanese forces feared them so intensely was the psychological dimension of their warfare. From the earliest stages of the Pacific Campaign, the Marines demonstrated an uncanny ability to adapt not only to terrain and climate but also to the behavior and tactics of the enemy. This adaptability became a force multiplier, allowing relatively small Marine units to have a disproportionate effect on the battlefield. Japanese soldiers, who had been trained to respond to conventional attacks and predictable maneuvers, often found themselves disoriented by an opponent who seemed to anticipate their every move. The Marines did not simply react, they reshaped the battlefield in real time, turning natural obstacles into tactical advantages and exploiting enemy weaknesses with calculated precision. In the dense jungles of islands like Guadalcanal, the Solomons, and Peleliu, this ability to use the environment strategically left Japanese troops constantly on edge, never able to fully trust their reconnaissance or intelligence. The psychological pressure applied by the Marines was magnified by their use of unconventional tactics. Whereas Japanese doctrine often emphasized frontal assaults and rigid formation attacks, the Marines employed a flexible approach that incorporated surprise, deception, and rapid mobility. Night raids, flanking maneuvers, and ambush counterattacks were standard tactics, executed with meticulous planning and thorough rehearsals. Even when Japanese troops thought they had the terrain and situation under control, the Marines could strike in unexpected locations, often emerging from dense foliage, riverbanks, or high ground with lethal effectiveness. This unpredictability created an environment of sustained mental strain, as soldiers had to anticipate threats that could materialize from any direction at any moment. The constant threat of surprise attacks wore down both morale and stamina, intensifying the fear that facing Marines was fundamentally different from facing other Allied forces. A further element of psychological dominance came from the Marines' disciplined use of firepower and coordination. Unlike units that might waste ammunition or fail to integrate supporting elements, Marines operated as cohesive, self-contained teams. Rifle squads, machine gun teams, and artillery support worked in concert, often executing combined arms tactics that could overwhelm isolated Japanese positions. From the perspective of a Japanese infantryman, the sheer synchronization of the Marines' combat actions was alarming. Grenades and rifle fire would arrive in rapid succession, followed by suppressive machine gun fire, forcing defenders into cover only to be confronted by yet another assault from a different angle. The ability to maintain cohesion and focus under these conditions created a sense of inevitability, as if the Marines were always one step ahead, able to dictate the tempo and outcome of engagements. Psychological warfare was also present in the way the Marines approached night operations and limited visibility combat. Japanese troops often relied on the cover of darkness to regroup, move reinforcements, or launch raids. Marines, however, trained extensively for nocturnal operations, using flares, reconnaissance patrols, and small unit infiltration to disrupt enemy movements. The knowledge that Marines could strike at night, when Japanese soldiers felt the relative safety of darkness, added a constant layer of anxiety. This fear was compounded by reports of Marines who executed silent but deadly attacks, eliminating sentries and patrols with precision before the larger enemy force could even respond. Over time, this contributed to a pervasive sense that no position was secure, no movement safe, and no strategy immune to disruption. The Marines' adaptability extended beyond tactics to the battlefield environment itself. Rivers, ridges, mangroves, and jungle clearings were not merely terrain features, they were elements that could be exploited in ways that Japanese forces had not anticipated. Engineers and scouts mapped the terrain meticulously, ensuring that every natural obstacle could serve as either a defensive position or a channel to funnel the enemy into disadvantageous locations. Ambushes were often carefully choreographed to leverage these features, with Marines appearing suddenly at critical moments to cut off retreat or flank attackers. Japanese units, encountering these maneuvers, struggled to adjust their traditional tactics, which were designed for open field engagements and linear battlefield control. The Marines' ability to make the environment itself a weapon elevated the psychological impact of every encounter, reinforcing the perception that facing them was an entirely unique challenge. Reports from Japanese officers frequently highlight the mental strain imposed by the Marines. Soldiers described feeling isolated even within their own units, constantly second-guessing the reliability of their intelligence and questioning whether reinforcements would arrive in time. The unpredictability of Marine actions meant that Japanese tactical plans had to be flexible at all times, often leading to confusion and hesitation in critical moments. This psychological edge, reinforced by repeated experience in combat, became almost as decisive as physical firepower. A unit that might have been numerically superior could still falter when confronted with the combination of speed, precision, and adaptability that characterized Marine operations. The fear was not irrational exaggeration, it was a rational response to consistent performance that Japanese soldiers could neither ignore nor fully counter. Furthermore, the psychological impact of Marines was amplified by their reputation, which preceded them. Tales of Marine effectiveness spread quickly, through both formal channels and word of mouth. Japanese soldiers knew of engagements in which small Marine squads had held positions against vastly larger forces, had executed surprise assaults deep within enemy lines, or had repelled attacks that would have broken lesser units. The repetition of these stories created an aura of inevitability and invincibility, one that imposed mental pressure even before the first shot was fired. Facing Marines meant more than facing trained men with weapons. It meant confronting the weight of their accumulated successes and the expectation that they would perform flawlessly again. The burden of this expectation weighed heavily on Japanese soldiers, influencing both morale and tactical decision-making. The Marines' psychological edge was further reinforced by their resilience in the face of adversity. Battles in the Pacific often involved extreme environmental challenges. Oppressive heat, torrential rain, disease, and supply shortages were constant threats. Marines were trained to endure these hardships without faltering, maintaining combat effectiveness even when conditions seemed insurmountable. Japanese troops, unprepared for this level of sustained operational capability, often interpreted it as almost inhuman endurance. The perception that Marines could continue fighting relentlessly while others succumbed to exhaustion or illness deepened the fear and contributed to a grudging respect, which often coexisted with hatred. Finally, the combination of adaptability, environmental mastery, disciplined firepower, and reputation created a unique psychological profile for the Marines. They were a force that could not be easily predicted, manipulated, or overwhelmed, and the Japanese quickly understood that conventional tactics often failed against them. Each encounter reinforced the notion that Marines were different. They were precise, unyielding, and strategically innovative. The fear they inspired was a product of repeated evidence, not superstition or propaganda. For Japanese soldiers, to face an American Marine was to confront a combatant who had already proven, time and again, that he could survive, adapt, and prevail under conditions that would break others. This recognition of capability, combined with the physical and tactical realities of the battlefield, explains why the Marines were feared more intensely than any other Allied unit in the Pacific theater. The fear of American Marines among Japanese forces was magnified not only by their rigorous training and tactical adaptability but also by the sheer weight of their reputation and the hard-earned respect they commanded on the battlefield. From the earliest engagements in the Pacific, word of the Marines' capabilities spread rapidly among Japanese units, creating an almost mythic image of an enemy who combined skill, endurance, and relentless determination. Reports from officers and enlisted men alike frequently referenced the psychological burden of facing a Marine unit. It was not simply that they were effective fighters, but that their effectiveness was consistent, almost inevitable. For a Japanese soldier, even an experienced veteran, this consistency created a sense of dread before battle had even begun. The knowledge that the Marines would execute their maneuvers with precision, maintain cohesion under fire, and exploit every weakness placed an invisible weight on Japanese units, shaping both morale and tactical thinking. One of the most significant aspects of the Marines' reputation was their capacity to achieve extraordinary results with relatively small numbers. Unlike traditional battlefield engagements, where larger formations often dictated outcomes, the Marines frequently demonstrated that tactical skill, coordination, and audacity could overcome numerical superiority. Small squads held strategic positions against larger Japanese forces, using careful planning, disciplined fire, and intimate knowledge of the terrain to outmaneuver their opponents. These actions created stories that traveled quickly: a platoon fending off an entire regiment, a handful of Marines executing night raids deep into enemy territory, or a single squad turning an ambush into a decisive counterattack. For Japanese soldiers, the repetition of these narratives across multiple campaigns reinforced the perception that the Marines were not only dangerous but unstoppable within the contexts in which they operated. The psychological effect was cumulative, conditioning troops to expect defeat even before engagement. The emotional impact of these encounters was amplified by the visibility of Marine leadership. Officers and non-commissioned leaders frequently led from the front, maintaining situational awareness, directing fire, and actively participating in combat. This approach contrasted with Japanese practices, where strict hierarchy often limited junior leaders' decision-making and exposed units to delays in response under pressure. The Marines' leadership style not only enhanced their operational effectiveness but also intimidated opponents who observed how seamlessly small units coordinated under the scrutiny of experienced leaders. The presence of a calm, competent officer at the forefront signaled organization, discipline, and an unshakable will, reinforcing the notion that these were not ordinary soldiers but a force with both tactical and moral superiority. Another aspect contributing to the Marines' fearsome reputation was their capacity to operate effectively in extreme environments. The Pacific Islands presented challenges unlike those encountered in Europe or mainland Asia. Dense jungles, mountainous terrain, swampy riverbeds, and tropical diseases created conditions that could debilitate even the most experienced troops. The Marines, however, had trained extensively for these very environments. Their approach to logistics, movement, and combat accounted for heat, humidity, and illness, enabling units to maintain operational capacity where other forces might falter. Japanese soldiers, facing opponents who could march through rivers, scale ridges, and fight through exhaustion without significant decline in performance, found this resilience unsettling. The consistency of their combat effectiveness under harsh conditions contributed to the perception that Marines were almost supernaturally capable, further solidifying both fear and grudging respect. The psychological weight of reputation was compounded by the Marines' innovative use of tactics that exploited both environmental and cultural factors. They often studied the behavior of Japanese forces, anticipating likely responses and planning operations to counter them. Reconnaissance, observation, and intelligence gathering allowed the Marines to strike where the enemy was weakest, turning predictable patterns into vulnerabilities. Japanese troops, trained in their own doctrine of offense and defense, often found themselves reacting rather than acting, responding to the initiative of Marines who had already calculated every possibility. The sense that the enemy had foreseen their moves and was always one step ahead undermined confidence and eroded morale, a subtle but powerful form of psychological dominance that complemented the Marines' physical and tactical capabilities. Cumulative battlefield experience reinforced this reputation. Across multiple campaigns, from Guadalcanal to Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu, the Marines repeatedly demonstrated their effectiveness in both offensive and defensive operations. Japanese soldiers came to recognize patterns. Small units could execute complex maneuvers with precision, individual Marines could exhibit extraordinary bravery and skill, and entire battalions could maintain cohesion under conditions that might shatter other forces. These repeated observations were internalized, shaping tactical planning and expectations. Units entering combat with prior knowledge of Marines' capabilities often altered their strategies defensively, choosing to avoid engagement when possible or deploying larger numbers to counter smaller Marine formations. Even these adjustments, however, were often insufficient, as the Marines' combination of initiative, adaptability, and coordination allowed them to exploit any remaining weaknesses. The emotional dimension of this reputation should not be understated. Fear was not merely tactical, it was visceral. Japanese soldiers described a mix of anxiety, apprehension, and awe when encountering Marines, feelings intensified by reports of heroics and acts of extraordinary endurance. Tales of Marines holding positions against impossible odds, executing precise assaults, and surviving conditions that would break other troops became embedded in unit lore. These stories circulated not only among combat units but also in headquarters, influencing commanders' planning and expectations. In essence, the Marines had become both a physical and symbolic adversary, a force that demanded caution, respect, and constant vigilance. This reputation also influenced Japanese perceptions of individual Marines. Soldiers often remarked on the courage, resilience, and effectiveness of particular men in ways that highlighted the psychological impact of facing the Corps as a whole. Accounts of Marine snipers eliminating targets with near impossible precision, squads conducting coordinated night assaults, and small teams repelling attacks with disciplined fire created a perception that each Marine was not merely a soldier but a unit unto himself, capable of changing the outcome of an engagement. The awareness that one might be confronted by such individuals contributed to a pervasive sense of vulnerability and reinforced the larger narrative of Marines as a uniquely formidable adversary. Ultimately, the fear and respect for American Marines among Japanese forces was not based solely on anecdote or isolated incidents. It was the product of repeated experience, rigorous training, exceptional leadership, environmental resilience, and consistent battlefield success. Each engagement reinforced the perception that the Marines could be relied upon to perform under pressure, to exploit weaknesses, and to maintain cohesion when other forces might falter. For Japanese soldiers, facing Marines was more than a test of skill or courage, it was a confrontation with an enemy whose reputation was both earned and justified by the realities of combat. The Marines' ability to combine all aspects of warfare, training, adaptability, leadership, environmental mastery, and psychological influence, made them an opponent unlike any other in the Pacific theater. This combination of factors explains why the fear and, in many cases, hatred of the Marines was so deeply ingrained. They represented not just a military challenge, but an almost inescapable measure of skill, courage, and tactical superiority that Japanese forces had to contend with at every turn.